Zamura ukuboko usome iyo ndahiro.
I, Michelle Martin, swear to tell the truth. Should I fail to honor this oath, may I face the rigors of the law.
Murakoze cyane. Ngira ngo turaza kugusaba kugerageza kuvuga gahoro witonze nako kubera dufite umwanditsi dukeneye kwandika ibyuze kutubwira. Watangira ukaduha ubuhamya bwawe burebana iyo context.
Okay. Again, I am a U.S. citizen. I'm here voluntarily to provide my testimony in these proceedings. My testimony is truthful and accurate and based on my own personal observations and experiences. I would like to share a little bit about my background information. I have a PhD in peace studies and international development from the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom, a Master of Social Sciences in Global Policy Studies from the University of Bristol, also in the United Kingdom, a Master of Social Work from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from San Diego State University in San Diego, California. I'm currently a professor of social work at California State University, Fullerton. I'd like to share why I'm here today. I have information that I learned beginning over 10 years ago that relates to this case and that I have agreed to share with the court. The information relates to my personal knowledge of the activities of Paul Rusesabagina and his associates with PDR, Ihumera, and their allies. I learned some of this information through my professional association with an individual named Providence Rubingisa, a friend and colleague of Paul Rusesabagina, as well as my direct experiences with Paul Rusesabagina and his organization, the Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation, in the general time frame of the fall of 2009 and about September of 2012. I want to mention that I did write out my testimony because it is very complicated. The information that I have came from numerous sources, and there's a lot of documentation, and I want to be very clear and precise. I also want to mention that a lot of the information I uncovered relates very much to the person that I am. As an academic and as a researcher, I have a natural curiosity, and if something captures my attention, I will stick with it until I figure it out. But I am not here in any sort of professional capacity, and nothing that I did related to uncovering this information was related to my professional career. I also wanted to mention about how I preserved information that I'm drawing on today in my testimony. Something else about my personality or the way I approach life is I keep pretty much everything related to technology, including taking screenshots on my MacBook if I'm curious about something or suspicious. I send emails to myself. I like screenshots because it creates a timestamp, so I remember In relationship to what I'm going to share with you today, I still have all of my emails and text messages and screenshots. And in fact, in preparing for today's testimony, I reviewed hundreds of old emails, text messages, screenshots of emails and text messages, notes I wrote to myself, emails I wrote to myself, and I still have all of that in my possession, both on my laptop as well as in a password-protected cloud service. I'm going to begin my testimony by sharing how I met a founding member of PDR Ihumera and an associate of Paul Rusesabagina. In the fall of 2009, I was a member of the faculty at a university in the Chicago area called Dominican University. I was on the social work faculty there, and in my first year, I was asked to facilitate a series of workshops on immigrants and refugees. I reached out to a friend and colleague who worked with a refugee resettlement. That he was someone who was a genocide survivor. Story, survival, and heroism. And that was Providence Rubingisa. I wanted him to be the first keynote speaker in the fall of 2009. He told a story impressive. He told survivor and how he rescued numerous heritage, which he claimed placed him at risk in Rwanda, early 2000s. And he fled to the United States. I was so impressed with his story, called Stuff for the Poor. I was so impressed during this time, which was approximately 2010, I provided a considerable amount of and charity. I'm now going to share was not completely fluent in English of his correspondence. On several occasions, with me via text message and email, and I still have copies of. Initially, he asked me to access his email account to respond to specific emails. He was looking at previous donors to his charity, the nature of his charity, as he explained during the conference. Local churches and schools donate used shoes, which he claimed he shipped to Rwanda, widows and orphans. This touched many Americans, and he was very successful at what he called shoe drives. Initially, emails so that we could have new beginning. He would ask me specifically, please go into my email and answer these emails. But eventually, he just started saying things like, you already have my password, just go in and handle that. And I would. The first time he asked me to access his email account was the fall of, and the last time was on September 8th of 2012, and that was in response to someone in another country. So in the beginning, again, it was related to his charity, but as time went on, he relied on me to answer a lot of emails. Assistance I provided Mr. Rubingisa, including allowing him to use my home office for long conference calls with other Rwandan exiles. Those were typically held on Skype, audio, and those calls were led by Paul Rusesabagina. The calls, I later learned, focused on a number of political issues. But during that time, a lot of the calls related to PDR Ihumera's support of PS Imberakuri. Most of the time, I mentioned before, these calls were on Skype. They would last for hours. They were in Kinyarwanda. Whether he was upset or not. He explained that the calls were facilitated by Paul Rusesabagina, and that's when he told me he was part of a political opposition group called PDR Ihumera. He described how the leaders of PDR Ihumera had asked Paul Rusesabagina to be the president of the party. So famous after the movie Hotel Rwanda. He told me they were supporting an opposition candidate who was the head of PS Imberakuri. I remember that Mr. Rubingisa explained on several occasions in late 2009 that his organization, PDR Ihumera, helped create PS Imberakuri. And I specifically recall him sharing with me that PDR Ihumera's plan was to support whom Mr. Rubingisa knew from school in running against President Paul Kagame in the 2010 Rwandan presidential election. He said their plan was that once Ntaganda was elected, Paul Rusesabagina would return to Rwanda and assume the role of president, which was an arrangement that Mr. Rubingisa claimed was agreed to by Ntaganda. I recall that on at least 2 occasions, after lengthy conference calls with Paul Rusesabagina and several other PDR Ihumera members, that Mr. Rubingisa expressed frustration about Rusesabagina, because he did not believe that he was providing sufficient financial support to PS Imberakuri. I also recall Mr. Rubingisa telling me that no one could know about Paul Rusesabagina's political ambitions because he was supposed to be just a humanitarian. In approximately January of 2010, Mr. Rubingisa asked if I would help Bernard Ntaganda write his political platform. He wanted it written in a way that would appeal to Western audiences. I'm a writer, an author. He also wanted me to help Mr. obtain a visitor visa by inviting him to speak at my university. But he then explained to me that Mr. Naganda would likely only visit Washington, D.C., and not Chicago. I did communicate with Bernard Naganda via email, and I did help him edit his political platform, but I did not provide assistance in helping him obtain a visitor visa. I still have those email communications in my email account. I'm now going to talk about Yahoo News Group posts that Providence Rubingisa forwarded to me from shortly after we met through early 2013. The posts were contained in emails from several Yahoo news groups managed primarily by PDR Ihumera members. I still have approximately 170 of these Yahoo News Group posts in my possession. I have them in PDF format, and I also have many of them in their original format. These posts contained primarily political content about Rwanda. They often had links to news articles, press releases, and other content. And they often included discussions and commentary by group members who were PDR Ihumera members. In fact, many of the news group postings were disseminated as emails, as I mentioned, and they had a trail of previous discussions, sometimes extending back months. And I got into the habit of scrolling down to the bottom and attempting to read through the entire thread. I do not speak Kinyarwanda, but many of the discussions were written with French and English interspersed throughout. Thus, I could often get a general sense of what was being discussed. While I initially did this out of sheer curiosity, in time, I began to read the discussion chains because I had a growing suspicion about this US-based group and its members. At some point, I figured out that I could use Google Translate, selecting Swahili as the original language. At that time, Kinyarwanda was not included in that platform, and that was generally useful for understanding the meaning of the discussions. I was previously aware that some political opposition groups were advocating for change in Rwanda, and I supported this within the vein of an open and free democracy. For this reason, in the very beginning, I was not concerned about the content. I'm now going to share my slowly growing concerns at that time about the news group postings that also coincided with my growing concerns from other sources. I mentioned earlier that from about 2009 to May of 2010, based on the information Providence Rubingisa was sending me, I was becoming convinced that there was an alternate narrative of the Rwandan genocide that no one else knew. And what I mean by that is no other Westerners knew. But in time, I became increasingly disturbed by the content and the bulk of the posts and emails, which were again highly political, with many posts having content reflecting what I later recognized as Hutu power ideology, including the denial of a Tutsi genocide. For example, in one news group posting that included an article of a genocide commemoration in Ottawa, Canada, with a photograph of Tutsi genocide survivors crying, the author of the post, a member of PDR Ihumera, wrote, quote, "Are they crying or faking?" Other posts included articles and commentary on the FDLR and Habyarimana. And the comments on these posts were consistently and overwhelmingly supportive in nature. Essentially, my perspective, after several months of reading, as well as other observations I will describe shortly, was that many of the news group discussions and other emails forwarded to me by Mr. Rubingisa and others, again, reflected strong anti-Tutsi sentiments, what I later discovered as overt genocide denial, and a clearly orchestrated plan to take their country back by any means possible. I'm now going to share information about media stories and other articles Providence Rubingisa shared with me about himself and other PDR Ihumera members, and what I eventually came to believe was intentional misleading of the American public. From approximately fall of 2009 through 2011 or 2012, Mr. Rubingisa was also forwarding to me various news articles about himself and, as I mentioned, other members of PDR Ihumera. And in these articles, they identified themselves as genocide survivors, working to support those remaining in their home country of Rwanda. I also noted that many of the PDR Ihumera members who spoke with the media provided what I believed were purposely misleading narratives. For instance, some very active members of PDR Ihumera who self-identified as Hutu in the Yahoo news groups would often identify themselves as Tutsi genocide survivors to Westerners. Others just identified themselves as genocide survivors and then provided conflicting narratives in media reports. It eventually became obvious to me that they knew Americans believed that quote-unquote genocide survivor meant that they were Tutsi. And I believe their attempts to confuse narratives was purposeful. For instance, they might share stories that were completely consistent with what happened to Tutsis during the genocide. Being stopped at roadblocks, being asked for their ethnic identity cards, having their lives threatened. But then the stories would take what seemed to me to be a false turn. The Interahamwe would let them go. And then they would escape into Zaire and live in the refugee camps along the border. Again, these statements appeared to me to be purposeful attempts to confuse the American public with conflicting narratives of the genocide and ethnic identities. I knew that some moderate Hutus were targeted and killed during the genocide, but I was unaware of any instances of Hutus being threatened with death after showing an ethnic identity card at a roadblock. Additionally, based on my research, I learned that most Tutsis did not flee Rwanda after the genocide, and those who fled during the genocide did so through oftentimes Burundi, but not Zaire. It made no sense to me that Tutsis would flee persecution after the genocide by following the path of over 2 million Hutus into exile into the Congo, many of whom were allied with the former regime, and some of whom were genocide heirs. I kept these media articles, many of them, and have included them with the other documents I provided to the Prosecutor General. Other things I observed during this time that made me suspicious included seeing the Facebook posts of some PDR Ihumera members who sent me friend requests. For instance, some had photographs posted in their Facebook photo albums that included FAR identification cards, as well as other identifying information, such as their old ethnic identity cards. And the names on them oftentimes did not match the names they were using in the United States. For instance, their ethnic identity card would oftentimes say they were Hutu, but they would self-identify as Tutsi or mixed. Additionally, throughout the newsgroup postings and other email communication, PDR Ihumera members and many of their American allies would frequently refer to the genocide as the so-called genocide. Or they referred only to a Tutsi genocide against the Hutu. I might not have recognized this alternate narrative as being false, and in fact, as I previously mentioned, at first I didn't. But the research I was reading at the time in preparation for my dissertation informed my thinking. I read everything I could on the region and the genocide, including books, scholarly articles, and studies and numerous reports from a range of experts with a range of perspectives. I'm now going to talk about being asked to write Providence Rubingisa's autobiography. I mentioned earlier that I'm an author. I have 3 books out, nonfiction, textbooks, and other publications. For several months during 2009 and 2010, Providence Rubingisa and I met regularly, and I interviewed him, writing notes of our sessions, which I still have in my possession. I interviewed him because he asked me to write his autobiography, so I was interviewing him as a ghostwriter. In our early interviews, Mr. Rubingisa shared the traditional narrative of the genocide, that extremist Hutus killed Tutsis and moderate Hutus. He also claimed that he was just as much of a hero as Paul Rusesabagina, because he too rescued Tutsi. In time, though, a conflicting narrative emerged, both within the interviews as well as in our general discussions. And that was a narrative that was more consistent with the newsgroup postings he was sending me. During the interviews and other discussions, he told me there was a story about Rwanda no one knew. He then shared that there was actually a double genocide. He stated that for every Tutsi who was killed, 1 or 2 Hutu were also killed. He initially told me that he was mixed culturally or ethnically, which would give him an advantage in understanding the ethnic conflict in Rwanda, but as I mentioned earlier, also put him at risk in Rwanda and was one of the reasons he needed to flee. But later in our interviews, as well as in other discussions, he contradicted himself, stating that both of his parents were Hutu, but that his dad and sisters looked Tutsi because they had quote-unquote thin noses and were tall and thin. He also provided several names of friends and colleagues who helped rescue his Tutsi-looking sisters and kept him safe during the genocide. At some point, I became curious enough to start searching through ICTR records, and I found several of the names Mr. Rubingisa had referenced with the associated locations, listed as being members of the Interahamwe. And I believe they are the same individuals to which Mr. Rubingisa was referring. For example, when Mr. Rubingisa was telling me about the night that former President Habyarimana's plane was shot down, he told me that he was watching a soccer game with a very good friend, Eugene Karekezi, Karekezi. I later found an ICTR judgment and sentence transcript online that referenced someone with that same name who lived in the same region, referenced by Mr. Rubingisa as being a high-ranking member of the Interahamwe. And that was in the case of Andre, Ntagerura, and two other people, and that was ICTR 9946T. Mr. Rubingisa also shared background information leading up to the genocide, including that all Tutsi families were harboring, quote unquote, RPF infiltrators, and that the RPF was killing Tutsis and then blaming it on the Hutus. I later learned that this narrative was completely consistent with the pre-genocide propaganda campaign disseminated on government-controlled radio and print media. Mr. Rubingisa also shared stories with me about someone he referred to as a good friend named Lieutenant Bizumuremya. I'm sorry, Bizumuremyi, who Mr. Rubingisa explained was sent to Gisenyi from Kigali. Mr. Rubingisa stated that he initially met the lieutenant in Kigali through mutual friends, but during the genocide, the lieutenant was staying at the Meridian Hotel in Gisenyi, which is where Mr. Rubingisa was staying. And he saw him, and they began spending a lot of time together and became much better friends. He even told me that he used to allow the lieutenant to use his room for visits with a female companion. He explained that it was the lieutenant who helped him rescue his sisters from Kigali. One of the books I was reading at the time was Linda Melvern's book, Conspiracy to Murder. In her book, Melvern describes the role of Lieutenant Bizumuremya, the role he played in the genocide, including instructing civilian Hutus to, quote, spare no one, not even babies, close quote. And yet Mr. Rubingisa described him to me as a hero. While describing his trip from Gisenyi to Gitarama to rescue his sisters, Mr. Rubingisa described a good friend of his named Omar, who was with the Interahamwe and manned a major roadblock in Gisenyi, and he shared how Omar helped him get through the roadblock without harm so he could safely leave Gisenyi. When I asked why he was friends with someone in the Interahamwe, he explained that he told Omar that he shouldn't be killing Tutsis, but only the RPF, and that Omar agreed. But I later conducted a Google search on Omar, Interahamwe, and Gisenyi, and I found an ITCR statement of someone by the name of Omar Serushago, Seruchago, who was an Interahamwe member who actively participated in the genocide and who carried out the orders of Anatole NsengiYumva. I believe that Omar Serushago is the same Omar referenced by Mr. Rubingisa due to many similarities, including Omar's location as being Gisenyi, Omar's role in manning a major roadblock in Gisenyi, and a reference in his ICTR statement to having worked with the lieutenant. Additionally, during one of our interviews, Mr. Rubingisa shared that it was government military who helped him and his sisters get through the roadblocks and who made arrangements for them to stay at the Bagogwe, Bagogwe camp, which he described as being 30 miles from the Meridian Hotel. When I read Serushago's ICTR statement, he stated in there that the Bagogwe camp was an Interahamwe military training camp. Mr. Rubingisa also told me that he had been invited by the ICTR defense attorney to testify on behalf of Matthew, Mathieu, he called him Matt, Ngirumpatse in Arusha. Other disclosures made by Mr. Rubingisa during my interviews with him included that he, and these are in quotes, had no problem with the Habyarimana government, that there was, quote, no ill treatment of the Tutsi prior to the genocide, that the, quote, RPF invaded Rwanda and Tutsi were killed because most Tutsi were affiliated with the RPF, close quote, that he believed, quote, more Hutus died than Tutsi, close quote, that there was no genocide, but rather there was a, quote, civil war with civilian casualties, close quote. All of this information ultimately led me to question who Mr. Rubingisa really was. Was he a genocide survivor who rescued Tutsis, or was he an extremist Hutu and member of or closely tied to the Interahamwe? I remained stoic during these interviews and at no time revealed what I believed I was discovering. I'm now going to talk about what I learned about Providence Rubingisa's arrival to the United States and the formation of his nonprofit charities. During many of my discussions with Mr. Rubingisa, I also learned that he moved to Romeoville, Romeoville, a Chicago suburb, in approximately 2003, and lived with Jean-Marie Vianney, Vianney, and the last name I'll spell is MudahinYuka, but he went by the name of Zuzu. Sorry. He was a high-ranking member, I later learned, of Interahamwe. Providence didn't want anyone to know because he said they would not understand. He also told me that Zuzu, who was arrested in 2004 on charges of genocide and then later deported to Rwanda in 2011, was innocent and was only arrested because he was being unfairly targeted by Kagame. He also told me that he had met an American who lived across the street from Zuzu at the local library. He explained that he told her that he was a genocide survivor and that he had no place to live. She introduced him to her husband, and they let him move in with them with their children. And together they started a charity called Global Family Rescue, also going by the initials GFR. Mr. Rubingisa explained that GFR sponsored families in Rwanda through fundraising in the United States, primarily from churches and schools. And Mr. Rubingisa got Paul Rusesabagina involved with GFR, which I'll explain later in my testimony. Mr. Rubingisa also told me that he started attending a local community church with the American couple he lived with, and through them met other Christians who wanted to help him. One woman ended up introducing him to friends of hers who were very involved in American politics, and together they started the Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation. In my testimony, I either refer to that as HRRF or the foundation, and that was created in 2006. According to my personal notes, which I still have, Mr. Rubingisa shared that he and Paul Rusesabagina were involved in both charities, but GFR was more Providence's, and Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation was more Paul Rusesabagina's. Mr. Rubingisa also shared that at one point in time, HRRF was concerned that they weren't doing enough humanitarian work, and I believe this concern came from someone accusing them of being a political organization. So according to Mr. Rubingisa, Paul agreed to award a $60,000 grant to GFR. Per Mr. Rubingisa, GFR was doing very well in Rwanda, sponsoring families in need, but was then investigated by the Rwandan government and was subsequently shut down. Mr. Rubingisa believed that this was because Paul Rusesabagina was involved. I deduced later from reading various emails that I will describe later in my testimony that many of the families sponsored by GFR were actually Mr. Rubingisa's family members and close friends. I also strongly believe that various projects Mr. Rubingisa fundraised for under the guise of helping widows and orphans in Rwanda were actually his personal projects in Tanzania and Rwanda. Once Mr. Rubingisa knew that GFR would not be able to continue working in Rwanda, they actually ended up moving to Uganda. He and the other American woman he met through his host family immediately started his charity Stuff for the Poor. I'm now going to talk about how I met Paul Rusesabagina and became a volunteer at Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation. Prior to when I started having suspicions, and in around the fall of 2009, Mr. Rubingisa offered to introduce me to Paul Rusesabagina, stating that they had been good friends in Rwanda. I was very excited because I had seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, and I believed he was a hero. I believe it was in approximately October of 2009 that I met Paul Rusesabagina at a restaurant in Chicago for dinner. And during dinner, he discussed his role in the 1994 genocide and his humanitarian organization, Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation, in Chicago, Illinois. He asked me if I'd be interested in working at Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation as a policy advisor on a volunteer basis, and I enthusiastically agreed. I began working at the foundation shortly thereafter. I volunteered with the foundation for much of 2010, and my work was primarily on the policy team with another American academic. Paul ended up writing me a letter of support for my faculty position and my contract renewal. And in that letter, he accurately described my volunteer role as conducting a, quote, comprehensive policy review, critically analyzing the Rwandan Constitution and other government functions and activities in order to highlight institutionalized forms of human rights abuses under the Kagame administration, as well as other supportive activities, close quote. An example of other activities was locating articles on the upcoming presidential election. I also attended several of Paul's speeches and foundation meetings. Additionally, I placed a graduate social work student from my university at the foundation as an MSW, so Master's of Social Work, intern, and she worked there from approximately January of 2010 to May of 2010. During my initial dinner with Paul Rusesabagina, as well as during all foundation meetings where he was in attendance, as well as during various speeches, including one at the Chicago Holocaust Museum, Paul Rusesabagina recited a narrative of the genocide that closely matched the Hotel Rwanda movie. Again, that the extremist Hutu government orchestrated the mass killings of Tutsis and moderate Hutus, and that he, Rusesabagina, protected Tutsis at the Hotel de Milcolin from extremist Hutus in the Interahamwe. Paul Rusesabagina also spoke about the importance of his humanitarian work and his foundation and his commitment to those he left behind. I recall during one foundation meeting in Chicago, I believe that was on February 15, 2010, because I took notes. And Paul Rusesabagina was in attendance at that meeting. The subject came up about accusations of the former Rwandan ambassador to the United States, James Kimonyo, who had accused Paul Rusesabagina of collaborating with the FDLR. The Americans in attendance laughed at the absurdity of the accusations, and Paul joined in, referencing how funny it was that Kimonyo was accusing him of something so preposterous. He then used these accusations as an example of just how far Kagame would go to harm him. And I recall at that time feeling outrage that his reputation was being harmed in this way. Another issue I recall being discussed by both Paul Rusesabagina and the American leaders of Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation were the conditions in Rwanda at that time. At the meeting on February 15th, 2010, Paul spoke in detail about how the streets in Kigali were empty because everyone was too frightened to be out in the community, stating something about how this information was coming from his contacts on the ground, who were reporting that people were so frightened to leave their homes, that they were starving, and I have in parentheses in my notes, or were not permitted to, that they were starving in their homes, and Paul Rusesabagina and the foundation were working with human rights organizations to try to get people food throughout Kigali. Around the same time period, which was about spring of 2010, my student intern forwarded a document to me via email that one of the American leaders of the foundation had authored and emailed to her when she told him that a friend of hers was planning a trip to Rwanda. In my former student's email to me, she wrote, quote, "He advised that my friend should review this document and consider asking these questions and then report back to the foundation on what her experiences were on her trip," close quote. The document was entitled "Questions to Ask When Visiting Rwanda." And the title on the first page of the document was, quote, "Visiting Rwanda, things to consider and questions to ask when you arrive behind the banana beer curtain." The first part of the document compared Rwanda to Soviet satellite states during the Cold War, with the Rwandan military controlling the perceptions of all visitors. The document introduces the reader to the, quote, corruption of the Tutsi-led government, including the government's one-sided genocide narrative that the genocide was only against the Tutsi, including how visitors were compelled to visit a genocide memorial as a form of indoctrination. The document is then organized by issues and includes recommended questions relating to each issue. The first issue was language, and the author notes that it is now considered taboo in Rwanda to ask any Rwandan what their ethnic group was, but it cites various quote-unquote clues about who is Tutsi, alleging that it is only Tutsis from Uganda who speak English, whereas, quote, uneducated Hutus, close quote, speak primarily Kinyarwanda. The document also asserts that friendly Rwandans that tourists meet are likely members of the RPF. The next issue is the 1994 genocide. And the author recommends that if that subject arises, the traveler should ask why Hutus do not qualify for any genocide survivor program benefits, as well as asking tour guides if survivors mind seeing their desecrated remains of their family members at the genocide memorials. The next issue is education, and the author encourages tourists to visit a school or university and ask about genocide ideology and how that applies to students and teachers. The author goes on to explain that, quote unquote, genocide ideology is a term used by the government to describe anyone who disagrees with the official view of the genocide. That Tutsis were the only victims. Other questions relate to solidarity camps, the exclusion of Hutu children from public education, and also what history lessons are taught in schools. Other assertions include referring to Rwandan local defense forces in rural areas as local militias, organized by the government to limit dissent against the quote-unquote regime. The document also refers to Tutsis as government elites and said that they should be asked the quote-unquote hard questions. At that point, I had no reason to question the assertions that the streets of Kigali were empty and people were starving in their homes. But I do recall feeling as though the questions were very ethnocentric, in that they were highly intrusive, reflected a strong Western bias, and appeared designed to catch Rwandans lying about their country. Even if the allegations in the document were accurate, I still believed that the questions were highly inflammatory and inappropriate. When I finally had the opportunity to visit Rwanda, to attend a conference and visit a university internship site, I was struck by the stark differences between what I was told by Paul Rusesabagina and the American leaders of Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation and what I experienced during my trip. People were out and about, mingling, shopping, eating out, and talking seemingly freely. And it really struck me then just how damaging this propaganda was to the people of Rwanda, as well as potential visitors from the United States. And I eventually perceived the content of the criticism to be a form of genocide denial. At another Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina meeting that I attended on September 21st, 2010, an American student from a Chicago university was present and shared her experiences visiting Rwanda through a study abroad program. The student mentioned being, quote unquote, fully briefed by one of the American leaders of the foundation before she traveled to Rwanda. And some of the quotes, some of the things she said, I wrote down exactly, and I'll read them. Quote, "If I didn't know all of this was going on in Rwanda, if I was a regular tourist, I would have no idea. Everyone is outside, walking around like nothing is wrong." Quote, "The genocide memorial was very emotional. I had to remind myself of the truth when I left the memorial." And quote, "They no longer have genocide survivors conducting tours at the genocide memorials because they would tell their personal stories, and that could lead to questioning about the story and the ability of people to question about whether Hutus got killed too. So now the government only wants English-speaking government tour guides to tell the government's version of the genocide." Quote, "All spokespersons in Rwanda are RPF." Quote, "The homestays coordinator for the students was a government agent and placed students only with Tutsi elites. When I asked her how she knew this, she stated, quote, 'Well, of course, why wouldn't they be?' She also shared that the family she stayed with accused her of genocide ideology because she challenged them on their story of the genocide. She stated that her host, father, was in technology, which convinced her that all of her emails were being monitored. She also talked about visiting refugee camps in Uganda, stating she was certain all of the refugees were Hutu. And when she interviewed the refugees, they apparently stated that they were, quote, waiting to go back and take back our country, close quote. Again, I recognize all of this later as genocide denial. I now want to talk about a curious pattern I noticed during the time period of March 2010 to April 2010 among everyone involved in the Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation, the Foundation's American allies, and members of PDR Ihumera. This pattern emerged for me both in discussions with them as well as in the emails I was reading. No one associated with Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation or PDR Ihumera seemed to believe that any Hutu accused of genocide was guilty. Rather, each incident of someone being arrested for genocide seemed to serve as an example of Kagame seeking revenge for political purposes and targeting Hutu intellectuals. One example that stood out for me involved a Rwandan exile in Dayton, Ohio. She reached out to me through Facebook on March 1st, 2010, to ask for my help in finding an attorney for her political asylum case. I had my role at the foundation on my Facebook page and was friends with several people affiliated with the foundation and PDR Ihumera. And I believe this woman reached out to me as a representative of the foundation. I still have these messages in my possession, as well as notes I wrote myself with my thoughts and concerns in regard to the situation and the foundation's response. The woman wrote that she came to the United States on a conference visa and learned just prior to her planned departure back to Rwanda that she had been charged in Gacaca for collecting names at a Pentecostal church in NYABISINDU during the genocide, and providing that list and providing a list of those names to the senior pastor, who in turn was accused of passing them on to the Interahamwe. She denied the charges, stating that the names were collected for the purposes of obtaining food from the Red Cross. I asked her to email me a statement of what she had shared with me in our messages so that I could forward her information to the foundation leaders and Paul Rusesabagina and 2 American attorneys who worked with the foundation and defended many Rwandan exiles charged with genocide. At around the same time, another Rwandan exile from the Boston area had also reached out to me asking for help and support from the foundation because she had been charged by U.S. immigration officials with lying on her political asylum application in relation to the 1994 genocide. She asserted her innocence and told me that she and her family members were genocide survivors and had sought refuge in Rwanda from extremist Hutus, just like everyone else. I referenced this woman's case as well in my email to the foundation leaders and the attorneys. One of the American leaders of Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation responded stating, quote, "As I said in an earlier email, we can devise a letter to our contacts at Homeland Security about the general issues that are facing Rwandan refugees and the political nature of the Gacaca courts and other charges against people recently to try to help them understand the political climate that people are fleeing, period. But what else should we be doing? I feel like," and then she referenced the names, 3 names, "are the tip of the iceberg, and that we need to get prepared because the iceberg is melting and the wave is coming straight at us," close quote. On April 11th, 2010, the American attorney responded again, asking if the foundation could provide financial support for the Rwandan exile in Dayton so she could have an attorney represent her at an upcoming hearing, stating that he was willing to serve as an expert witness in her case, as he had with other Rwandan exiles charged with genocide-related crimes, because his conscience would not allow him to do nothing while the U.S. government sent innocent refugees back to Rwanda. He concluded by stating, quote, "Actually, all caps, we are now in the same position Paul was in at the Mill Colleen. If people are going to get saved from Kagame, we have to do it." Of course, that was then, this is now, and that was him, all caps, and this is us, all caps, exclamation point, close quote. At some point later, when I recognized this collective response to genocide accusations among the foundation staff, Paul Rusesabagina, and other PDR Ihumera members, I Googled the details the Rwandan exile in Dayton had shared with me about her case, and I found a news article that I was confident referenced the church where she had stayed, and it was a Pentecostal church in NYABISINDU, where 560 Tutsis were slaughtered, and at that time the remains had still not been found. After reading the story, I reached out to the woman and asked if she had at all been suspicious about why she was asked to collect names of only Tutsis, since the Interahamwe had surrounded the church. And that was according to media reports, but also her statements to me. And she replied, quote, "No, I never looked out the window." I found this very suspicious. She had already told me that the Interahamwe were out there and that they kept coming into the church and taking Tutsis out to kill them. So her answer made no sense to me. I subsequently learned that the Rwandan exile in Boston and her sister, who had also been charged by U.S. immigration officials, had in fact been involved in the genocide in relation to a roadblock in Butere in front of a family-owned hotel. The details of the family's involvement were absolutely horrifying. Yet both of these women had identified themselves as traumatized genocide survivors who hid during the genocide within their communities. They said this in their communities to the media and to me. And one was even writing a book about her story. Again, what I found odd was that none of the individuals on the email chain ever questioned whether any of these individuals charged with genocide-related crimes were potentially guilty. I'd like to now share some information about growing concerns both I and my student intern had about the nature of Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation and the type of work they were doing. Within a few months of working with the foundation, both my student intern and I had come to believe, based on our observations, the foundation did not operate as a humanitarian organization at all. Rather, it operated as a political organization with the apparent primary goal of overthrowing the Rwandan government. I knew that in the United States, an organization that is registered with the Internal Revenue Service, what we call a 501c3, is barred from engaging in political activities, including lobbying, which the IRS defines as contacting decision makers about legislation and asking for support one way or another. Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation was registered as a nonprofit, non-political charity providing, quote, human services, close quote, focusing on, quote, human rights, basic and emergency aid, and international development, serving children and youth, women and girls, low-income people, and victims of conflict and war. And that information is public, and anyone can look it up on the internet. Between approximately March to May of 2010, my student regularly reported to me her discomfort with the nature of the foundation and its singular focus on Rwandan politics and the lack of any humanitarian work. As social workers, we were very familiar with how humanitarian organizations operated in the United States. And it was our observation that the foundation activities were inconsistent with a non-political humanitarian foundation. For instance, Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina's foundation mission statement read in part to, quote, improve the lives of victims left orphaned and widowed by the various killing fields in our world's history, close quote. And yet neither I nor my intern observed any activities that focused on widows and orphans during the several months we were associated with the organization. Again, the primary focus of Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation and Paul Rusesabagina appeared to be solely on removing President Kagame from power. When an American attorney was arrested in Rwanda in late May 2010, and this was an attorney that was closely affiliated with Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation, my intern contacted me with significant concerns because leaders of the foundation were asking staff and interns to lobby U.S. government officials for his release, something my intern believed was inconsistent with the role of a non-political humanitarian organization and her role as a social work intern. I'm now going to talk about how I learned about the extent of the political pressure the Hotel Rusesabagina Foundation and PDR Ihumera exerted against the government of Rwanda, and specifically against Paul Kagame. Although I began to withdraw from my volunteer work at the foundation by the summer of 2010, once my student had completed her internship, I did attend one last meeting, as I mentioned earlier, on September 21st, 2010. Paul Rusesabagina was not in attendance at this meeting, but the American leaders were. I took detailed notes during this meeting, which I still have, which centered on the U.S. conflict mineral bill, the Spanish indictments against 40 RPF members, as well as the upcoming United Nations MDG meeting in Spain that was co-chaired by Paul Kagame. During that meeting, American Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation leaders described the foundation's efforts to put pressure on the Spanish, I have here Prime Minister, but I think he may be a king, to not meet with President Kagame for the MDG meeting. One of the American leaders stated, quote, "Our message is, do you really want this guy as the face of the MDGs?" They also explained how the foundation helped the quote-unquote Spanish delegation get various meetings with missions to the United Nations, including the Mexico mission to the United Nations, as well as Spain, France, and Turkey. They also explained that the foundation had provided information obtained from PDR Ihumera members, which was used in the UN mapping report. They talked about how Rwandan local defense forces had demanded that Hutus dig up their family members' bones for more genocide memorial sites, even if their family members had died years prior to the genocide. And that they did this because they wanted to create more genocide memorials and bones naturally deteriorate. They added that Providence, Rubingisa, and Pio, who we'll talk about later, had family members die in the genocide, and their bones were on display, and there was nothing that they could do about it. I recalled that during my interviews with Mr. Rubingisa, he stated that he was fortunate that he had no family members die during the genocide. So I knew this was false information. Whether the American leaders of the foundation knew, I wasn't sure. I'm now going to talk about how I began to collect names and details about PDR Ihumera members and why I chose to do this. By late spring of 2010 is when I began collecting names I saw in various news group emails and other emails forwarded to me. As I would come across additional information about an individual through Googling, additional information from the emails, or Facebook if someone had sent me a friend request, I would note that on the document. My motivation for researching the members of this network was rooted in my growing belief that these individuals were actually the former regime, or at least allied with them. In fact, I had recently discovered that a founding member of PDR Ihumera living in the United States and very involved in the foundation was wanted by Interpol for genocide. I was also concerned that this network was purposely misleading the American public and fundraising under false pretenses, including in my own community. I'm now going to shift to another important issue that is related to Providence Rubingisa's email account. As I mentioned earlier in my testimony, Mr. Rubingisa had initially given me the password to his email account for specific purposes. But by early 2010, he authorized me to monitor his email account so I could regularly respond to potential donors, to organize shoe drives, and coordinate other agency activities. This required that I review various emails to ensure I was catching the emails, warranting a response, as well as reviewing older emails for previous donors he'd lost touch with. He had over 10,000 emails in his email account, most of which were in Kinyarwanda, but many others were written in English or had English subject lines or were written partially in English. On a few occasions, relatively early on, I saw things that caused me alarm. For example, I saw a 2009 email from Pio, who was Paul's assistant in PDR Ihumera, to the leaders of PDR Ihumera, informing them of an important upcoming meeting. The email was written entirely in English and stated the following, quote, all, comma, this Sunday, May 24, 2009, a meeting of the Rwanda Legal Assistance Initiative has been scheduled. The conference call meeting will take place at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, USA, or 8 p.m. European Time, and then it provided the number. Reports from diverse media outlets this week indicate that a second military operation is about to be launched against the FDLR by the UN's MONUC, M-O-N-U-C, peacekeeping forces, and the DRC Army. Traditionally, UN peacekeeping forces do not take sides overtly in any conflict, but that's exactly what they are doing in the DRC conflict. We need to find a way to expose the criminal nature of this bias in order to save our FDLR brothers and sisters under threat of extermination. We will also have an update about the ongoing persecution of Leopold Munyakazi. Please notify your friends about this meeting and its critical importance so they can attend in big numbers. Looking forward to meeting you all Sunday. Pio. This and other information I saw led to my decision to start taking screenshots of any emails I happened to come across that I found particularly disturbing. In total, I took approximately 121 screenshots of emails. Some examples include an email dated April 29th, 2010, with the subject line, DC meeting, from Pio NGILIKILIKESHA to Jerome NAYIGIZIKI, Dr. Eliel ELIEL NT AKIR UTIMANA, Providence Rubingisa, Paul Rusesabagina, Emmanuel Matata, M-A-T-A-T-A, and Emmanuel Haki Zamana, containing several photographs of their meeting and the message, which was, I translated it. These 7 big leaders are part of the brain trust of the next big thing in Rwanda, the PDR Ihumera revolution. The team I see was in good shape, but it was worth it. Be strong, Pio. Mr. Rubingisa later explained to me that the purpose of the DC meeting was for PDR leaders to discuss their selection and support of Bernard Ntaganda in the August 2010 presidential election, and their plans for Paul Rusesabagina to take over as president in the event that Ntaganda was elected. There were also numerous photos included in that email of themselves. I also took a screenshot of email communication among PDR Ihumera leaders sharing edits of Paul Rusesabagina's letters to diplomats and politicians critical of the Rwandan government, and specifically of President Paul Kagame, that were later disseminated under Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation letterhead, including letters to former President Bill Clinton and Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi. Email communication between PDR Ihumera leaders, editing a press release regarding Paul Rusesabagina's meeting with Representative Nancy Pelosi on May 15, 2007, citing numerous criticisms of the Rwandan government and stating that the only way for the country to move forward was for Kagame to be removed from power. This letter was later emailed to a foundation leader for dissemination on foundation letterhead. A 2010 email from PO to other PDR Ihumera leaders, including Paul Rusesabagina, with an attached lawsuit filed against Paul Kagame during a recent visit to Oklahoma. A May 2010 email of a news group posting with members of a non-political charity in the United States with the initials of OPJDR that I later learned was associated with PDR Ihumera, with edits to Paul Rusesabagina's letter to France's then President Sarkozy, criticizing Paul Kagame, with numerous comments and edits by PDR Ihumera members. A May 2010 email from Emma, M-A-T-H-I-E-W, to PDR Ihumera leaders, including Paul Rusesabagina, Pio, Jerome, someone named Eleazar, L-E-I-E-Z-A-R, Z-I-H-E-R-A-M-B-E-R-E, and Emmanuel Hakis Zimana, who was in Canada, with an attached article written by Calixte, C-A-L-L-I-X-T-E, last name spelled M-B-A-R-U-S-H-I-M-A-N-A, who underneath his name said he was the executive secretary of the FDLR, entitled, quote, FDLR Reactions to Recent Events in Rwanda and to Various Statements Made by Rwandan Officials. An email from Mr. Rubingisa to Paul Rusesabagina with instructions on supporting P.S. Imberakuri. A May 2010 email from PO to PDR leaders, including Paul Rusesabagina, with Paul Rusesabagina's statement and denial in response to Rwanda's accusation that he was supporting the FDLR, which was later disseminated on foundation letterhead. An email from Providence to someone with the name Gloria regarding his ability to obtain 22-karat gold, cassiterite, and coltan from Africa. Additional emails regarding mineral dealing among Mr. Rubingisa and others in PDR Ihumera, sourced out of the DRC, including lead, ore, O-R-E, I'm assuming that's ore, copper, coal, beryl, and M-A-N-G-A-N-E-S-E. And each of those has O-R-E after it. Once I was relatively confident from what I read and observed that PDR Ihumera members were either the former regime or allied with the former regime, some of whom I believed had been members of Interahamwe, and based on my understanding of genocide research, were engaging in genocide denial and the dissemination of propaganda very similar in nature to the pre-genocide propaganda campaign. I made the difficult decision to copy to PDF any email that I found particularly disturbing. Ultimately, over the course of several months, I copied approximately 747 emails and downloaded approximately 1,076 attachments. The following is a summary of just a few of these emails and attachments that I was able to translate and that I believe are pertinent to this case. I downloaded the PDR Ihumera founding documents that were email attachments sent to PDR Ihumera founders. An email exchange dated June 21st, 2006 that included critical comments about the early formation of PDR Ihumera and the lack of information about the party that was posted on RwandaNet, which was one of their Yahoo news groups. The email that contained the newsgroup posting was forwarded to PDR leaders with the following comment in response to the criticism, quote, "Since you live in Paris, I inform you that Mr. Paul Rusesabagina, accompanied by some officials in the Party for Democracy in Rwanda, and in parentheses, PDR Ihumera, will be in Paris this Saturday, June 24, 2006, to meet members of the Rwandan community living in France, wishing to be informed about the PDR Ihumera party in general and on the role of Paul Rusesabagina in particular." That comment was written by Pio. He then responded to the PDR leaders included in the email, writing, and this is translated, quote, "Be strong. I think," someone's last name, M-U-R-A-Y-A, I'm sorry, A-Y-I, is doing a fantastic job. And I believe this was in reference to his response to the criticism. Janvier may have the problem that Muriai seems to be alone in the field. I don't think there should be any concerns, but we will all be very soon on these discussion groups. And it is impossible and even unwise to react to all kinds of concerns on the net. In most cases, especially in politics, it is wise to keep silent and to let people guess. We have to cultivate the mystery from time to time. I am sure that Kigali is already trying to figure out which foot to dance in front of, but that also could have been figure out how to respond to the new organization. That said, these meetings we plan to hold on the weekends are crucial because we need to have something to announce to people at a better time. Also, are there any French and Kinyarwanda versions of the declaration? If so, good. If not, we must create them as soon as possible. Should we also write the speech and perhaps also the text of the press release in these two languages? Here's an idea. Last weekend was a big hit. We need to think about the next move, and the next, and so on. I mean a more or less spectacular event that is somewhat headline-grabbing. It's a great thing that Paris will follow next weekend. But do we already have to think about the weeks and months to come? Pio. The PDR Ihumera leaders included in this email were Clement Gerard, Pio, In that email, it was spelled NGILIKILIKESHA. Antoinette, UWIMPUNDU. Emmanuel Hakizimana. Emmanuel Matata. John Calvin, RUTTIMAN, last name NTAKIRUTI. Angelique, UWILIWABO. Michael, SHYIRAHAYO. Etienne, TWAGIRUMUKIZA. Janvier, BUSOGI. He was also the individual who released the FDLR press releases. Celestin Kabanda, Kabanda, and I found out that he was a former member of the MDR party in Rwanda. And Celestin, MUHINDURA, that I found out later was ex-FAR. Dr. Ilil, NTAKIRUTIMANA, who I believe was the son of Elizaphan, with that same last name, who was a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, who was convicted by the ICTR in 2004 for crimes of genocide. Anastasi, ANASTASE, REK, last name is REKERAHO, and then Providence Rubingisa and Paul Rusesabagina. On October 9, 2007, October 9, 2007, email from Pio with a press release in response to accusations that Paul Rusesabagina was a genocide denier and a founding member of PDR Ihumera. And in that press release, he stated, quote, "Finally, we want to make one thing absolutely crystal clear. Humanitarian Paul Rusesabagina is not a member of PDR Ihumera." An email from Jerome, who was the PDR secretary, to PDR Ihumera members, including Paul Rusesabagina, with a reference to a Jesse Jackson Rainbow Push fundraiser on September 6, 2007, and a PDR meeting that next day, and then a meeting with Jesse Jackson, and a September 9th attendance at a church event. The email begins, quote, "In Chicago, they will be meeting," and then he included the word R in all caps, RUKOKOMA, and then stated, "I don't want to use this word, but this is the word that we all understand very well." And then there was a document attached to an email to PDR members with an attached list of documents to be reviewed at the big PDR meeting in Brussels. And an email dated October 10th, 2010, from Celestin, MUHINDURA, who was a founding member of PDR Ihumera, who at the time lived in Wichita, Kansas, to other PDR Ihumera members, referencing the development of what he called a national council to coordinate all of their efforts toward, quote, liberation. The email had an attachment named CEPR chart, October 10 draft, which was the charter for this proposed national council. The council was described as an umbrella organization for the political efforts of NGOs, including IDD, OPJDR, DIR, FFDR, RAYA, HRRF, and CRD, and the political organizations PDR and RUD, followed by an ellipses indicating that the list was incomplete. The document also included track changes by Celestin, who was not only a founding member of PDR Ejumero, but was also the founder of IDD, one of the NGOs listed. An August 12, 2010, email exchange between Clement Gerard, Providence Rubingisa, Augustin, NDA, HAYO, and PS Mburakuri, referencing their commitment to financially support PS Mburakuri through donations received by IDD. PS Mburakuri referenced needing financial support for more militants. Providence Rubingisa referenced the UK decision to stop aid to Rwanda until the government released all political prisoners. Clement responded to the request for financial support with, quote, "We consulted with Celestin and he agreed to donate as much as we could through IDD. So now I am going to ask how much is available. I gave my 100, close quote. Numerous emails and attachments about Rwanda briefing, inter-Rwandan dialogue, and the Spanish indictments. A September 2010 email from Octave MUGAB OWIN EZA to PDR Ejumero leaders in reference to Paul Rusesabagina's project to push the ICTR to prosecute Paul Kagame and RPF members. And there was an attachment entitled Task 1.doc, and the email included instructions on collecting testimonies on RPF crimes that were to be provided to the United Nations, with the hope of adding the testimonies to the mapping report and also to be shared with US legislators for lobbying purposes. Emails regarding PDR Ejumero's coordination and support of PS Mburakuri, including what appeared to be reports to PDR members and Paul Rusesabagina on prison visits. And then emails written by Mr. Rubingisa's American partner and his host family in GFR to a group of evangelical Christians in support of Mr. Rubingisa's political asylum application, which was apparently held up due to an accusation of genocide. And an email by the same American to James D. Kay with the US State Department, vouching for Mr. Rubingisa, stating that in his heart, he did not believe Mr. Rubingisa committed genocide. I believe the State Department employee was targeted by Mr. Rubingisa, who had met his daughter through the same refugee resettlement agency I referenced in the beginning of my testimony, who then referred him. And I later learned that Mr. Rubingisa was granted political asylum in the United States shortly thereafter. When I evaluated the emails collectively, which took me a very long time, what I was able to glean from them, combined with my other sources of information, was that Mr. Rubingisa and Paul Rusesabagina appeared to intentionally target Americans with political connections and other talents, such as writing. One reason why I believe this is because whenever Mr. Rubingisa would make a new connection with an American, including myself, or achieved a specific goal, such as fundraising or facilitating a big shoe drive, he would often forward the relevant emails or media articles to PDR Ihumera leaders and his family members in Belgium and Rwanda, reporting on his progress. It also appeared as though most of the political opposition groups worked in very close coordination, and org charts that were included as email attachments appeared to indicate that they were all related. Something I found particularly disturbing was that many of the PDR Ihumera members, who I had been able to trace as having been members of the former regime, ex-FAR, were not only self-identifying, as I mentioned before, as genocide survivors, but had been able to obtain positions as African scholars at universities and at genocide research centers, such as the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And some had even received scholarships reserved for scholars working to prevent genocide. Others were in policy positions in the United States and Canada, and some even held UN positions. It was very clear in their internal discussions that they used these positions to disseminate propaganda, narratives of the genocide that were not supported by experts and scholarship, but were consistent with the pre-genocide propaganda campaign, a double genocide theory, or a Tutsi genocide against the Hutu. There were also emails and attachments about the Veritas Rwanda Forum and the Intro-Rwandan Dialogue that appeared connected to the Spanish indictments of 40 RPF members. Emails regarding 2 meetings for the Intro-Rwandan Dialogue included names of those who attended, and I noted that most of the attendees were members of PDR Ihumera, including Paul Rusesabagina and Providence Rubingisa. I now want to talk about another grouping of emails I obtained that contained information highly relevant to this case. At some point in approximately 2009 to early 2010, before I had become suspicious, I agreed to allow Mr. Rubingisa to use one of my laptops. When I got the laptop back later, I noticed approximately 80 emails in .eml format, which is Microsoft Outlook. They were contained in a temporary file. I ultimately moved them to a permanent folder. I saved them in PDF format. I also made sure to save them in their original format. Some of the emails I took screenshots of as well, and you can see at the top of the photo a reference to the temporary file. Among these emails were the following: emails from 2007 describing a Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation Rainbow Push fundraising event, including emails sent by American Foundation leaders to PDR Ihumera members coordinating planning, an email from Jerome, Naygiziki, to 51 what appeared to be PDR Ihumera members, but this one did not have any American Foundation leaders included, with an itinerary for the event, including the Rainbow Push fundraising event on September 6th, a major PDR Ihumera meeting the evening of September 7th, and another event on September 8th, and emails describing the Foundation's planning for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. An email dated January 23rd, 2007, from John Calvin, NTAKIRUTIMANA, the son of convicted genocidaire Pastor Elizaphan of the same last name, notifying 25 PDR Ihumera leaders, including Paul Rusesabagina and Mr. Rubingisa, of his father's death. The email characterized his father in very positive terms, including stating that he, quote, lived a life of service to the Lord. John Calvin also thanked the email recipients for their support and prayers. Emails from and to Mr. Rubingisa that indicated his for-profit shipping company was conflated with his not-for-profit organization, Stuff for the Poor, with regard to shipping containers of used items to Rwanda and Tanzania to be sold. More emails from and to Mr. Rubingisa about mineral dealings in the Congo. A June 18th, 2000 email from an American leader of Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation to Jean-Pierre Busogi and Mr. Rubingisa, approving of their draft, and a letter to President Bush from Paul Rusesabagina with suggested edits. A May 14th, 2007 email from PO to PDR and foundation leaders, including Paul Rusesabagina, with a draft attachment with PO's edits for a foundation press release announcing Paul Rusesabagina's meeting with Nancy Pelosi on May 15th, 2007. A September 20th, 2006 newsgroup posting containing the text of Paul Rusesabagina's September 20, 2006 letter to President Bill Clinton, posted by a PDR Ihumera member asking for edits. Also, Providence Rubingisa's Skype was still logged in when I got the laptop back, and I could see the screen from his last conference call and all of the attendees' mobile numbers. I still have the text where I told him that he left his Skype logged in, and that I was alerted to this because he'd gotten a call. And I took a screenshot of the screen and still have that in my possession. I mentioned before that my realizations evolved slowly and simultaneous to other experiences. I did not read and understand the emails immediately. Rather, it took me time to go through them and make sense of what I was reading, including piecing together what I could translate. I am now going to talk about a collection of emails that I believe is the most relevant to this case. Around the summer of 2011, as I was reviewing all of the emails, the screenshots I took, the emails I copied to PDF, the emails left on my laptop, I noted a collection of email exchanges I found very worrisome. Despite not being able to read them, I noted references to money, Western Union, and some names of people that I knew were affiliated with the FDLR. I eventually had some of them translated. In total, I have in my possession 33 email exchanges between Mr. Rubingisa and someone by the name of Fernando, last name Ngamiji, which I have reason to believe was probably a pseudonym, who was a self-identified fighter with the FDLR in the DRC. Some of the emails CC'd Paul Rusesabagina, Jerome, Naygiziki, and Dr. Elil, who also went by Dr. Nataki. At least 2 of these emails were sent directly to Paul Rusesabagina with a forwarded email of Fernando's email attached. Once I was able to read some of the emails, I immediately recognized that they were not propaganda, like so many other emails, but rather they represented concrete attempts of PDR y Humera, including Paul Rusesabagina as the party's leader, to provide financial support to the FDLR for the purposes of, according to the emails, violently overthrowing the Rwandan government. The emails discuss amounts of support, how money would be transferred to the FDLR, Western Union information, Paul Rusesabagina's trip to South Africa to meet with first name IGNACE, last name MUNYESHYAKA, who was an FDLR leader, for the purposes of buying weapons, and also included detailed information on the weapons requested by the FDLR soldier, and a discussion of how and where the weapons would be purchased. In one email, Mr. Rubingisa refers to sending him a container that Fernando could sell, which I believe was a reference to the containers Mr. Rubingisa used to ship used shoes to Central Africa through his for-profit company and not-for-profit charity Stuff for the Poor. PDR y Humera budget information was also discussed in an email from Mr. Rubingisa to Paul Rusesabagina. The FDLR commander seemed to regularly report on the events in the battlefield, and Mr. Rubingisa consistently assured him of Paul Rusesabagina's and PDR y Humera's support, stating in one email, quote, "We will never fail you." Mr. Rubingisa referenced the Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation fundraiser with Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push organization in Chicago on September 6, 2007, and stated that one of the agenda items for PDR y Humera's meeting on September 7th, 2007, was the issue of providing financial support to the FDLR. Other emails had a subject line and discussion referencing Ambassador James Kimonyo accusing Paul Rusesabagina of traveling to South Africa to meet with the FDLR in relation to buying weapons. I have turned over this set to the Prosecutor General, along with the other relevant emails and documents, but I would like to read a few of them. A few of the more pertinent emails as a part of my testimony. On March 22nd, 2007, Fernando wrote, "I received your message. We've already prepared the financial needs. I have already found a priest who will be helping us so that the money can more easily reach us. He will be working with another guy in Kampala who will also be facilitating money transfers to us. I've already selected people who will be working on that, but I'm still waiting for you guys to send the means. But it should be a secret between you, because this thing needs sacrifice, because we are in the middle of the enemy. So please try to do something, despite the fact that conservatives are here, so that we can work with the courageous ones. I am waiting for a reaction with the determination to win." At 10:07 a.m., Mr. Rubingisa responded, "Hi, I will speak to Jerome and Paul and Doctor so that I can give you a response, but please know that it is positive. Are you still in communication with the guy in South Africa who you told me met with Paul? Otherwise, we shall put you in contact with him. We've chosen a person who will be your contact that you will be speaking to, particularly on your needs and steps. He is in the U.S. military, but he is a Rwandese, and we agreed that we are going to put him in contact with a guy in South Africa, and then the guy in South Africa will give him your contact information. Otherwise, those kinds of people are everywhere. Even in our case here, people don't have the same logic. So is it okay? Should I be able to send you the news? Are you able to read? Thanks. On April 13th, 2007, Mr. Rubingisa sent an email to Paul Rusesabagina, forwarding an email from Fernando stating, Paul, Fernando is serious. I think we should talk very seriously. I will call you to talk about GFR because they have already asked you to give up that grant you have given them, and you will need to accept that they will use it in another country. They already put on the internet that GFR will move to Uganda. Be strong. Read that Fernando message below. Fernando's message reads, Good morning. I have received all of your messages. Now I think that the person you used to ask me about has already talked to Malumba, and he has also sent me the news he shared with him, which should concern us as the people challenging Paul R. ideology should not be an issue. You should start working on that, but know that the start cost is a lot of money because of the work that it requires. We need at least $500,000 for the first 5 months. And Paul R. should plan that most people will show up because of the propaganda of his politics in the youth, as we do not want to stay in the jungle without any progress. My regards. On July 9th, 2007, Providence forwarded this email to Paul Rusesabagina and Dr. Elil, stating, the people I spoke to told me they have asked for a budget of $500,000/5 months to support their work. But I asked him to work on a small budget and look at how we can support them. Be strong. On August 9th, 2007, Mr. Rubingisa wrote to Fernando, I just wanted to know if he could be your liaison in South Africa. There are other small issues that you should also start looking into. For instance, to send you money if the Western Union method is not working, if Kagame closes the other area. What would be Plan B? I have another question for you that I think I'll be asked by my colleagues here. Now that we've started working together, what about those people that you've been working with? Now that we're going to be supporting you financially, if things go well, is this going to create any problems between you guys? In fact, you should talk and let us know about your position. Can you guys find the landmines there if we give you money? What about those that can bring down the birds? Can they be available from there? If you think you have those that can bring down the birds, military tanks, and the landmines, do you think that will be enough for you to carry out the operations? In short, you let us know what you need and what you have there, then we can also start beginning to look around. Fernando responded, "How are you? I got your message. It was very long and clear. As for the equipment, you should try to find them there. Those that are available locally, I didn't put them on the list. But what I can say, there are different kinds of equipment that will enable us to counter the force, because those birds and those equipment that move on the chain makes him so proud. But plan B is still there, and there could be another plan. Okay, talk to you later." On August 22nd, 2007, Mr. Rubingisa forwarded the August 9th email to Dr. Elil, Paul Rusesabagina, and Jerome, stating, quote, "Please read this attached message. The rest we shall discuss when we are in Chicago." On August 27th, 2007, Mr. Rubingisa emailed Fernando with the subject line, quote, "6th event," which was the date of the Jesse Jackson fundraiser, stating, "I received your response, and I think this will go through because a lot of people are negotiating with us so that we can work together. We are also still thinking about it and seeing if we can do it. The problem here, are you guys working with them? What about their saying about people who are on this side or that side? What is all that about? Please respond, because we have a very big meeting in Chicago. That's where we shall discuss your problem in detail, because there are things we don't want to discuss on the phone. It will be better for you to be together and avoid divisions. And by the way, what is your position? If you have any more information that you want to send to the members of our party, you can let me know. But it would be better if you wrote a message so that I can read it in the meeting. It would be interesting for the people in the meeting to hear that I am reading your message. Be strong, be vigilant. We are doing the same, and we shall never abandon you. Providence. On September 17, 2007, Fernando wrote an email with the subject line, Paul R. versus Comonio, and in parentheses, USA, stating, "Hi, I received your information. I heard on Voice of America Kenya Rwanda program, Paul Rusas and Comonio and others. Even though Kagame doesn't accept the opposition from our side, I believe he will one day bow down. It's just a matter of time." Mr. Rubingisa responded, "How are you? Has the fighting stopped? There is a time you told me these people who are helping you politically, but you didn't tell me who they are, because for us, in PDR, people are confused. Those divisions that we are hearing about between you, are they for real? We are hearing that Munyeshayaka is on the other side. What is that? What we really want is to know where we stand exactly, because we want everyone to be on the same side so that we can fight Kagame, because he is our problem. Those divisions serve nothing other than making him stronger. People are absolutely ready to contribute money every month, but we want to do it in a manner that shall not make us go backward or fail, but to be able to sustain and never quit. So please help us and look at those small issues and address them. Talk to your guys, and I'll talk to my guys, and we'll find a solution. Thanks." On October 11th, 2007, subject line, Ray:, U.S. ambassadors accused of arms dealing. Fernando wrote, "How are you? On this side, we are okay, and the fight against Nakunda is going well. We are very optimistic because he has already lost a lot of his positions. He is now in the mountains, close to the bamboo forest. Please send me again your message because it didn't come except the subject, because I am waiting. Who knows what happened to that message? Stay well." At 4:20 p.m., Mr. Rubingisa responded, "Hello, we are okay and we are very happy because of how you are hitting Kagame, since there is no difference between Nakunda and Kagame. I met Paul face to face on the other issue of supporting you, and he accepted your proposal. And we agree that we are going to do mobilization so that we can start sending you the support at the end of December. I also told him about the other equipment that you've been asking for and asked him to speak to our businessmen in Europe and see how we can find those in Asia. He told me that he is in contact with MURWANASHAYAKA. Oh, yeah, okay. Just ask it for now. 5 minutes break.
Niki.
Okay.
Niki.
She asked me if I needed a break.
Urukiko ntabwo rurabibona, ntabwo ari inshingano zawe, ngira ngo nitubibona turaza kubimubaza. Hari ako ukeneye? Hari akaruhuko ukeneye umutangabuhamya?
In a few minutes would be good, just in a few minutes. If I could get through these, then I'd like to take just a quick break.
Usigaje ibintu bingana iki? Ibisigaye.
I just have a few more.
Okay.
Okay.
Ubwo wakomeza niwumva ukeneye akaruhuko tubwire tukaguha.
Okay. I will. Thank you. I'm just trying to find my place. Hold on one second. Okay. I'll reread this. At 4:20 p.m., Mr. Rubingisa responded, "Hello, we are okay and we are very happy because of how you are hitting Kagame. Since there is no difference between Nakunda and Kagame, I met Paul face to face on the other issue of supporting you, and he accepted your proposal, and we agree that we are going to do the mobilization so that we can start sending you the support at the end of December." I already read this part about Asia. "Even though other people have limited capabilities, we have our Paul, who was given to us by God because he can reach anywhere. But the good thing with him is that he wants us to be united because divisions will not help us except giving our enemy a new momentum. So you guys should start organizing people who will be receiving the money, and you should take a strategy of changing these people periodically, because even on our side, we're going to be changing people who will be sending the money, but not more than 15 of them. Do you think after you finish Nakunda, that gentleman there will help you cross back? NB:, I forgot to tell you that Paul told me to ask you if changing your name and dividing yourself into 2 groups just for political reasons if that would be helpful to avoid the fact that we are on the list. Second, do you think that if we were to seek the support from Tanzania to allow our people to pass their way for training, do you think that will be better? So you let me know. Please continue to update me on the news of the battlefield. On October 28, 2007, with the subject line, U.S. ambassadors accused of arms dealing, Fernando wrote, "Hi, I understand those contacts, that MURWANASHYAKA and the other guy have, but I know our organizations from its roots, and that is possible. But there are a lot of conservatives in different decision-making positions who don't want change. But we, the youth, we want to move forward. But for them, no, they don't want to. I think for me, the guy you spoke to should be the guy who should be given the position of president. The rest should be his assistants. And I think that's the reason why, because of their selfishness, they don't want to change the name, even they know the list exists. So the second proposal of having two organizations is what we have chosen. So those who do not agree with us, once they are weakened, they will come by themselves, because we have to be prepared to execute our plan in advance so that Kabila cannot maintain his power, hold on to power by sacrificing us for the sake of diplomacy. Otherwise, somehow we are currently working with people here about our infiltration into Goma, Butembo, Rwanda, and Kampala. He will never tell where we get our means. Whatever bad things he wants to do to us, he cannot succeed. And about the possibility of helping us to cross back, I don't think he has the heart, because I know for sure he is afraid of Kagame. His army is weak, and Kagame's infiltrators, especially those generals who served in RCD, they still work for him, to the extent that they can even spoil what we are doing. Another point is that if we create a second organization, Kagame will not be able to say that it is the FDLR that changed its name, because by the time he will be saying that, what is important is to capture Rwanda, and then everyone will get their share. Second, to get the green light from Tanzania is very important, especially because if they agree, Kagame will be finished, and that will help Kabila be courageous. And Tanzania is more influential than any other country in the Great Lakes, particularly on political, military matters. That means victory shall have come, and the enemy will be obliged to defend himself on many different fronts, and he is going to be weakened from all over. In fact, tell him to move faster, because Tanzania has a successful history of helping people get into power. They are unstoppable. It's a known fact in the region. 3, briefly, the president of the outside opposition, who is credible, should be the guy that we speak to, so that CI and USA should bring us together, coordinate us, because we are the majority. Speak to you soon. Mr. Rubingisa responded, "Are you okay if I take a really short break right now? I have just a couple more emails, but they're a little long."
urukiko rwavugaga ko amasaha asa n'agiye, tugeze hafi saa 11. kugira ngo tubaze gahunda ufite ejo dukomeje ugakomeza nka saa tatu n'igice ukaba ushoje kubera ko tubona ugifite ibintu byinshi kandi hari abantu benshi hano bigaragara ko barambiwe. Hari
I just have
ikibazo
a few more pages.
ku buryo urumva byafata nk'igihe kingana iki? Ni
Maybe 10 minutes.
ngira ngo abandi mwakwihangana iminota 10 ntabwo ikiri myinshi tugasoza no mutangabuhamya. Mwihangane, nta iminota 10 ntabwo ikiri myinshi kugira ngo ejo tuzatangirane n'undi. Okay, noneho wakomeza.
Okay. Providence responded, "Hi, there's a lot happening in a very quick way, to the extent that there are things that we have to do quickly so that we don't lose the opportunity or even find out if these people have adopted or taken another solution, especially in this area where we Hutus are. So people have adopted or taken another solution, especially in the area." I'm sorry, I just repeated that. So the information we have is that Americans are tired of Kagame, but they are saying that because the information we have is that but they are saying that because Rwanda is peaceful, we have to leave it the way it is. So we have to do everything possible so that something happens as soon as possible. And that thing about the name is very urgent, but I will let the other man know that you are in agreement, then we shall discuss about the name. Murwanashyak. These people here, they don't even want to hear his name. They say he is a negative force. This was said last week. So tell people, your people, that we actually know he is innocent, like many others, but we have to be very intelligent in how we make our decisions without just pleasing ourselves, but finding a way of making the Westerners happy. And then after those who are innocent will be cleared. But if we don't play it well and have a very good strategy, we shall lose. And yet things are moving very well in our favor. We met with the Congolese, those who came with Kabila, one of our guys, and their Minister of Defense. We wanted to see if we could negotiate a fighting base. What we got from that meeting is that Congolese are tired of Rwandese, whether it be Hutu or Tutsi. What they want is that those tensions between Hutus and Tutsis, we should take them back to our country. We didn't reach any agreement because that man, it is said that he is not on good terms with Kabila, so he's not powerful. So we are pushing to see if we can see the big boss. Please try as much as possible to convince those people, the Congolese, to make them understand that we need everyone's support, and that if they see anybody whose motives are to be in a power struggle, they should avoid that person. Here in America, we are fighting for the ordinary people, because I don't think even when we capture power, we will leave our jobs and go back. Question: if you get the financial support of 50,000 USD per month, can you do something, even without a base? Please try to think quickly, because things are moving faster in the region, and we have to move just as quickly. Stay well. On November 17th, 2007, Mr. Rubingisa wrote, "We're going to start on the 5th of December 2007. Paul told me that Murwanashyak seems to be dragging his feet and that he was not able to see him. He called him and asked him to come to meet him, and he told Paul to instead come to his house. But instead, Paul gave him Jerome's contact so that they could meet in Brussels in 2 weeks. So please send me the names of the people we will send the money to. Please know that the amounts will be increasing every month because we agreed to start with a few people, and then we shall increase the amount every month. Stay well. NB : this time you'll get the money from Goma, but give us different people's names. Fernando: hi, here are the names of the people who will cash the money from Goma. As you had asked me, they are, and then there's 3 names, and then North Kivu, Goma, DRC. But when you are done with transferring the money, those through Western Union, please send me on each case the name, last name, first name, address, telephone, amount expected, town and country of origin, money transfer code numbers, question and response. That will ease the operation. God bless you. On November 18, 2007, Providence forwarded the November 17th email to Jerome and wrote, Jerome, send this email to Antoinette. Next month, those are the people we are going to send the money to. Thank you. The last email was sent by Fernando to Mr. Rubingisa on December 11th, 2007, stating, hi, it's Fernando greeting you, and I want to inform you that I changed my email address because my old identity is known by many people, and I get a lot of messages in my box that are mixed, so I will close it in 1 week. So correspondence shall be sent to this email. What about the other program where Jerome was going, Mirashwanyaka in Brussels? Did that happen or not? When is Rusesabagina expected to arrive in Lusaka, Zambia? Because there are people who went there to steal his assets. I'm following minute by minute, but accept that their ideology is short-sighted because they will not succeed. That is what I am getting from people who called me on the phone. That is it for today. Once I discovered that Paul Rusesabagina, Mr. Rubingisa, and their associates with PDR Ihumera were engaging in these activities that seemed likely to be illegal, I turned everything over to U.S. law enforcement and cooperated with an investigation from approximately February of 2012 through early September 2012, serving as both an advisor and as an informant. During several of the meetings I had with Providence Rubingisa, they were also monitored by U.S. law enforcement. I want to mention something right now about that I think will impact potentially my credibility, and I want to be very transparent. I mentioned earlier that I came to Rwanda. I came to Rwanda in December of 2011 with another American scholar, academic, to attend a conference. It was my desire at that point, once I handed everything over to law enforcement, to transition to an academic role in support of Rwanda. So I had the hope at that time with the other academic that we were going to sign a contract with Rwanda to help in a more academic way understand the nature of the diaspora relations in a positive way. When I met with U.S. law enforcement, they asked me to postpone that, and I agreed to do that. After I was done working with law enforcement, I then signed a contract with the Rwandan government to provide academic support. Because of the nature of the work I had done with U.S. law enforcement, it was advised to me that I should register for the Foreign Agent Registration Act. I did not have any intention, and nor have I ever lobbied the U.S. government on behalf of the Rwandan government. Everything I did of my own accord. But because I had worked with the U.S. law enforcement, I wanted to be very transparent because the contract involved paying me for my scholarly work. The FARA application is public record. I will talk in just a few minutes about how that has been used against me and my credibility. Very quickly, I just want to say, and I only have 2 pages left. When I met with Mr. Rubingisa, when I was working with U.S. law enforcement, He ultimately disclosed much of what he was included in the emails, including his contact with the FDLR fighter and Paul Rusesabagina traveling to South Africa to meet with Mirwana Shayaka. I met with him on June 4th, 2012, at a restaurant in the Chicago metropolitan area. I took very detailed notes, and U.S. law enforcement was monitoring this meeting. During a discussion about the FDLR conflict in the region, Mr. Rubingisa stated to me, "You know, I was in touch with them for 3 years ago. I was communicating with them." I said, "Who?" And he said, "A guy from the FDLR." I said, "How do you know he was really the FDLR?" And he said, "I know it was, but then Paul, he messed it up. We were supporting and things like that, and I set the whole thing up. We always did that, made Paul look good. And then Paul went to meet with them in South Africa, and he made so many mistakes. And we think maybe Kagame people got involved. There are people in prison right now because Paul messed things up, so they stopped communicating. They tried to reach out to me again recently because I wasn't sure who it was, because Kagame people always trying to trick us, so I didn't respond. Plus, I don't have to do that now because we can just go through people we know and have them reach their family members. Like me, I have a guy I know who I'm in touch with who was very high up in Interahamwe, who was still in the jungle. He grew up in my dad's village. I can talk to him. So talking to the FDLR people is not hard. So that way, when it comes time to fight, they will be there with us. I said, so Paul wiring the money was true. And I asked, why did he do that in his own name? And Providence responded that Paul would always have other people do it, like him or Pio, but this time he decided to send it himself. Quote, because he is lazy, and thank God he is cheap because he sent so little. The most was 800. Thank God he is cheap, close quote. During this same meeting, he also told me that he was the one who decided to merge PDR Ihumera to start the Rwanda National Congress, the RNC, because he believed PDR Ihumera would never be successful since they only had Hutu members. He shared that although they weren't initially going to have Paul Rusesabagina join them as a founding member, they did ultimately decide to have him be a founding member in 2011 because so many Hutus followed him and thought he was a hero. They later learned that Paul was working behind their backs to keep PDR Ihumera going and was talking to the editor of an extremist Hutu newspaper run by a Hutu Catholic priest in an attempt to undermine the RNC leaders. So at an RNC meeting in Brussels a few months earlier to my meeting with him, they forced his resignation. One thing I want to talk about briefly was a text message exchange, which I still have. On September 8th, 2012, Mr. Rubingisa and I exchanged texts about their attempts to recruit rebels from Rwandan universities to help start social movements in Rwanda by building cells inside the country. But they were concerned because of the many spies at the university. Providence wrote about a friend of his named Jamaica, who was recruiting youth from a refugee camp in Uganda to enter Rwanda and create internal conflict. On September 18th, 2012, we had another text exchange, and he told me that Jamaica and Alexis, Bakunzibake, of PS in Burakuri, were recruiting youth from the Nakivale refugee camp, which was further north from the Rwandan border because it was, quote, more safe. I still have this text message on my phone, and I also have it printed out and saved as a PDF file. One more thing I would like to talk about, I'm almost at the conclusion, is one of the things I noticed throughout the emails was what I perceived as bullying by PDR-EHumera members and many of their associates and allies of anyone who challenged their ideology or any institution that worked with President Kagame. These aggressive tactics involved subjecting targets to online attacks, and in some instances involved the filing of civil lawsuits against them. Examples include PDR-EHumera members posting messages about books or articles in the Yahoo news groups that they perceived were critical of their activities or perceived as being supportive of the Rwandan government, and then asking members to respond in a coordinated manner. These were not posts debating the merits of the books, articles, or activities, though. Rather, in most instances, they involved online attacks that were often very personal, with many including the individual's employers or publishers in the post. My impression of these attacks was that they seemed designed to intimidate scholars, journalists, church leaders, etc. And from what I could tell, they were very well coordinated and they were highly successful. An example of institutional bullying was the filing of lawsuits against universities that invited President Kagame to speak, and including university administrators in the lawsuit. While these actions may not have been illegal, they did remind me of research on what's called swarming, which is defined as a form of negative online advocacy designed to intimidate and cause harm to individuals and institutions in an attempt to compel an outcome, which in this case was silencing critics and isolating the Rwandan government. One example of institutional bullying is a lawsuit filed against William Penn University in 2012 after the university announced that President Kagame would be a keynote speaker at the May 2012 commencement. The PDR network, which at that point had merged with RNC, barraged the university with letters and a range of threats, mobilizing support through Facebook and various posts from blogs by organizations that frequently coordinated with PDR-EHumera network, such as Friends of the Congo. The university did not withdraw the invitation for President Kagame to speak because they had 4 president scholars, students from Rwanda who were graduating. Mr. Rubingisa and Paul Rusesabagina organized a demonstration against the university and filed a lawsuit on May 11, 2012. And according to one of the emails, had President Kagame served during the commencement via his security detail. The lawsuit named co-defendants, the president of the university, Ann Field, the vice president of student advancement, Steve Noah, who had developed the Rwandan Scholar Program, an American attorney who often represented the Rwandan government in the United States, and Stephen Rapp, then Assistant Secretary of State. While I support any individual's right to express themselves through protest and other democratic means, what this network was doing was swarming targets, which again involves the virtual organizing of multiple groups to achieve a particular outcome. When swarming is facilitated by what's called smart mobs, a large networked group of people, it is often considered undemocratic because the goal is to intimidate people and organizations with threats, such as what is called nonsense lawsuits. I was so disturbed by these well-coordinated aggressive tactics that I did some research, some online research, and found various empirical studies about swarming and smart mobs. And I also found a publication by the RAND Corporation, a well-respected political think tank, referring to these types of tactics as a form of modern-day warfare. I mentioned before that it was my goal to work with Rwanda in a productive manner within my area of expertise. And I mentioned that I was asked by U.S. law enforcement to wait to sign a contract until the investigation was over, and I agreed to do that. And I signed a contract. I believe it was in October, I believe 2012. I would have to look to confirm that. And I registered with FARA, again, a public document out of an abundance of caution, even though legally I was not required to do so because I was not advocating on behalf of Rwanda with US legislators. These tactics were used on me because at some point, PDR Ihumera found out that I was no longer on their side. And in the summer of 2014, which is when I registered in June of 2014. I may have my years wrong, but I know I registered. In the summer of 2014, when PDR Ihumera members and their American allies learned that I was no longer on their side, I was subjected to over 15,000 tweets calling me a Kagame agent and a paid Kagame spy. Most of the tweets included my home address. Some of them included death threats, and all of them tagged my then employer in what I presumed were attempts to cause me to lose my job. I want to conclude my testimony by discussing my motivations for being here today. Walking away, the moment I suspected, I was in the midst of a network of genociders, genocide sympathizers, and apologists, would have been so much easier and would have allowed me to protect my career and my private life. As I prepared this testimony, I spent a considerable amount of time reflecting on my original motives, including reflecting on what prompted me to do what I did and to keep going when at times I felt like I was completely in over my head. I felt like I'd stepped into a minefield and I wasn't always sure what to do or how to handle the information I found. I am not a politician, nor do I have the mindset of a politician. And my choices may not make sense to some people involved in the geopolitics of this region. In all honesty, I believe that what motivated me to follow my instincts and take the risks I did relates to my gender. I am a woman and I am a mother. And while most combatants in protracted civil conflict are men, women and children by far bear the brunt of the long-term burden and consequences of violence in this world. And the impact of violence on women and children was and is very personal to me. As a woman and a mother, I feel a connection to women everywhere, including women in Rwanda. I hope this is obvious, but I want to say this very clearly. The Rwandan government never directed what I did. They never did. I did this on my own. They did not influence my testimony. These are my words. And as I mentioned before, I have all the emails and documentation to back it up. It's very hard for me to come here today, but I believed it's my duty as a woman and as a mother to speak the truth about what I know and to find the courage to do something about it, including coming here today and testifying before this court. And that's all I have.
Mutangabuhamya mwashoje mwarangije.
I'm Yes.
wakoze cyane. Reka hari utubazo dukenga tubiri dutatu gutya turukiko kugira ngo
Yes.
utange amakuru arushijeho gusobanurira urukiko.
Watubwiye yuko hari inyandiko nyinshi wagiye ubika zirimo za email izo wavanaga kuri Facebook mu binyamakuru. Watubwiye ko watangiye kubikora mu 2009. Niko bimeze?
I had emails forwarded to me in 2009, but I did not start collecting emails. I have it in my testimony. I think it was approximately May of 2010. I think it was around the middle of 2010. Because I remember that it was after the American attorney came here and got arrested. It was after that point that I was certain that I wasn't dealing with genocide survivors. I believe it was after that point that I started taking screenshots and then I started copying the emails.
Ibyo byose ubyegeranya washakaga kugera kuki? Nihe mpamvu yatumye ugira ubwo butwari bwo kwinjira muri email ya Rubingisa ugakusanya ibyo bintu byose?
First, I'm just a naturally curious person. Second, when I started putting the pieces together and figuring out who they were, quite honestly, I was outraged. I've felt a passion for Rwanda for a very long time, and it was one of my dreams to be able to work and support this country in one way or another. Quite honestly, even back in high school, I had a passion for animals in Rwanda. That's kind of what started it for me. And when I found out that it was actually members of the former regime and genociders and genocide sympathizers, I was outraged. I was outraged by what they were doing. I was outraged that they were taking advantage of Americans. And because of what I do for a profession, I know very well the impact of conflict. And as a mother, I just didn't feel like I could walk away. I just didn't feel like I could have this information. And I asked myself, well, I was teaching an ethics class, and one of the questions was, what would you do if you found out something along the lines of during Nazi Germany? And everyone always answers, I would do anything I could to help people. But that's not what the research shows. Most people don't. They're bystanders. And when I found myself with this access and this information, I asked myself, what are you going to do? And I remember agonizing over it. I was also working with different aspects of Rwanda. I was coordinating with an agency in Chicago that was doing work here. I developed an internship site with CNLG, with my university. So I had I knew survivors in my community, very close to several young survivors, girls, that I actually thought of as my daughters in many respects. And I just didn't want to be the type of person that was a bystander. And that's the best way that I could explain it. I had this access, and I decided to do something about it.
Ayo makuru uratubwira ngo wayagejeje ku nzego z'umutekano za Amerika. Abagusubije iki?
I can't really talk about the U.S. law enforcement case. I've been asked not to, not by anybody here, but in the United States. But all I can tell you is that I participated in an investigation from approximately February of 2012 to early September 2012. And I was not privy to what happened to the investigation after they told me that I was no longer needed in the investigation.
murakoze. Tugarutse ku nyandiko zivuzwe haruguru wagiye umenya zinyuranye muri screenshot yawe, hari ahantu wavuze yuko watangiye kugira impungenge umaze kubona ko hari ibiganiro bitangiye kuza bivuga ku bijyanye n'ingengabitekerezo ya Hutu Power, noneho no ku byavuga kuri FDLR. Tugarutse ahangaha kuri FDLR by'umwihariko, ese waba wibuka nk'amagambo yaba mu nyandiko cyangwa mu magambo Rusesabagina baravuze ubwe uyibuka wayavuga?
So most of the emails were like a group of emails with numerous email addresses, and his email address was always included. In fact, 2 email addresses for him, one for the United States and one for France. The most in terms of his own engagement with those emails, other than being a recipient, is every once in a while he would post something and say, "For your information," typically in French. And then it would be that, a lot of the members of PDRE Humera and other email addresses as well.
Urakoze. Ikindi kibazo, hari aho wavuze umwambasaderi umwe ku itariki ya 15 z'ukwa kabiri 2000 umwambasaderi umwe ngo washinje Rusesabagina gukorana na FDLR, noneho uvuga ko hari naho bavuze ko bavuganaga ibijyanye n'intwaro nako ari mu bukanire gutanga intwaro na Western Union. Ese ubwo bufasha nibwo bwonyine waramenye baba yarabahaye cyangwa hari ubundi bufasha waba waramenye? Niba ubuzi wabutubwira.
So that was an accusation that my understanding from being at various meetings, I could be wrong, but I believe at the Rainbow Push fundraiser, and it may have been later than, no, it would have been maybe before that. I'm not sure of the time frame. That Ambassador Camonio had made that accusation, but it was in some public forum. I do remember that. But other than that, the other information I have would be the emails that I just read to you. And I don't know if those two are related.
Byabihagije, igisubizo kirahagije. Itariki navuze 15 z'ukwa kabiri 2010. Murakoze. Birahagije.
Reka tujye kuri inyandiko wakoresheje. Ni inyandiko nawe ugeze kuyivugaho. Iyo nyandiko ni yawe, watubwiye ko wayikushanyije, ni ibikubiyemo n'ibyawe, hari abagufashije kuyitegura, kubera ko turaza gusaba ko munayiduha kugira ngo ije muri dossier.
Yes, I already gave it to the Prosecutor General, but yes, I have various drafts on my laptop. I worked on this for months. After I was attacked online, I stopped all contact with Rwanda. I changed my research. I moved away. And as far as I was concerned, the door was closed. I never wanted to open it again. But even though I kept everything, it took me a very long time to put this together. I had to go through everything again, remind myself of things, and it took me a very, very long time to create it. Again, I have multiple drafts of it, and I'm the one that wrote this. And yes, I would provide this to you. I believe it already has been provided, but if not, I will provide it to you.
kubera iki wumvise ko ari ngombwa kwifashisha inyandiko uza gutanga ubuhamya?
Because for me, the way I think, I'm a writer, and I write. It's easier for me when I write to connect things and to remember things. It's one of the reasons why I use technology so much, because it helps me remember things, it helps me connect things. I'm not sure that I initially wrote this thinking that I would read it. But eventually, when it got to be so long, I just wanted to be clear and precise. And I even have, this is my copy, I have all cap headings to remind me of things if I felt like I could just talk and then read the emails, which is why I said I would prefer to read it just so I could make sure to remember everything and be very precise, because in so many ways this was simultaneous at the same time that it was linear. And it was very difficult for me to express it in a way that I felt would make sense, because so many of these realizations were occurring at the same time, but from so many different sources. So writing it is easier for me to think, and it's easier for me to express myself.
Noneho turetse inyandiko tukakubaza ngo ibyo watubwira amagambo make ku buhamya waduhaye, wabirezima gute, wabisobanura gute mu magambo make, minota 2, incamake y'ibyo watubwiye byose udafite inyandiko?
I would tell you that I met Providence Rubingisa through a conference that I facilitated in the fall of 2009. He was a keynote speaker for me. He told a story of being a genocide survivor. He told a story of being a hero and rescuing Tutsi. He told, in the conference, in the workshop, he told us about his charity stuff for the poor. He told us about fleeing into exile. I came up afterwards to thank him, and I told him how impressed I was and that I wanted to help him. We started working together on that, and I provided a tremendous amount of support for him. And again, I have those emails as well as the documents that I created for him, website. I wrote a lot, I mentioned a lot of his correspondence. I wrote conceptual things, I made contacts with people, I facilitated shoe drives. And then at some point he wanted me to write. I was hired as a ghostwriter on a couple of occasions for a few books, and he asked me if I would write his autobiography in fall of 2009, and I agreed. I interviewed him several times, and I have all the notes from that, and I can tell you it's 13 pages of detailed notes. It was through that time, I could look at that document and tell you the last time that I updated or saved it. That would give me kind of a time stamp on when that was. I do recall that it was between March, April, it wasn't March, it was like April, May that I started getting suspicious. I would tell you they introduced me to Paul Rusesabagina in the fall of 2009. I recall driving down to Chicago and calling my niece and telling her I felt like I was going to meet royalty. I was so excited. Then when I met with Paul, he asked me to work for Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation as a volunteer, and I was so excited. The offices were in downtown Chicago. I went down there quite a bit, maybe once a week or so. I attended several meetings. I placed my student, who's an intern, there in January of 2010, and she worked that spring semester. Between the two of us, and of some of those correspondents, not all of them, we started talking about our suspicions at that point. It was first about the agency, questioning why it was so political. One of the things that they would do is they would call the members of this political party Team Rusesabagina. So we noticed that there was a lot of conflation between the two, and that just didn't seem right to us for a humanitarian organization. I would tell you that Providence gave me his password on a number of occasions, and I was in his email all the time, looking through emails, responding to emails. that at some point I saw some things that were really disturbing to me, and they matched up with other things that I was experiencing at that time that I mentioned before. The fact that nobody was guilty of genocide, the fact that there was a double genocide, and then that, I noticed that evolved, that narrative evolved. It started off as a double genocide, but soon it became something where it was like only one genocide, and it was the Tutsis against the Hutus, not the other way around. When I asked about why it was no longer considered a double genocide, he said that people had done the numbers, academics had done the numbers, and that there were far more Hutu that were killed than Tutsi. He also said that it was the international community that came up with the guidelines for when to start counting deaths. That if you went back to 1990, there were more Hutu killed than Tutsi. I would tell you that when I saw some things that disturbed me, I started taking screenshots. I would tell you that at some point I made the difficult decision to copy. Now, I copied around 700 emails out of 10,000. I didn't have time to go through everyone. I didn't have the ability to translate everyone. So sometimes I was going by pictures, or I was going by if the subject line was in English, or if there was English in there that I could figure out. I didn't have the time to go through all 10,000. There was no way that I even came close to capturing all the emails. I just looked for the ones that I thought looked problematic. I would tell you that I thought that in the beginning I believed it, and I was supportive of them, and my emails reflect that. When I first emailed them about this Rwandan exile in Dayton, Ohio, I expressed concern about it. So I know by that time that I hadn't completely figured it out at that point. I would tell you that when my students started coming to me with concerns, that added to my concerns, very much so. And that together we started talking about it and wondering who these people really were. I would tell you that the newspaper media accounts, I remember one in particular, and I referenced it vaguely, about the showing the identity card and getting pulled out by Interhamwe. In that one specifically, he was asked to dig his own grave. And then the way he told the story afterwards, it didn't make sense to me. And I just found that so disturbing. And the reason why I wanted to mention how I am as a person, I take screenshots of everything. If I pay a bill online, I take a screenshot of it. If I'm trying to remember something, I take a screenshot of it. The reason why I have my cell phone crashed in 2012, and I lost a lot of my texts. The reason I have the text of his password is because I couldn't remember it, and I got tired of scrolling back up through all of our texts, so I just took screenshots, a couple screenshots of it, so I had a picture of it. This is just kind of who I am. I'm not detail-oriented in my everyday life, but when it comes to technology, I am. And then it became very purposeful. Like I said before, at first it was curiosity. Anyone sent me an email with a long chain, I'd read it. But then it became purposeful when I started suspecting it. I was very familiar with the genocide. I read Machete Season. I read Shake Hands with the Devil. I know what happened. And when I had this realization of who they were, I couldn't believe that I was right in the middle of it. In fact, I remember thinking, could it be possible that I figured this out? And I didn't understand why others hadn't. Because even though I went to a lot of work to connect the dots, it wasn't that hard. And I didn't understand why other people weren't figuring out the conflicting narratives. But there's a difference between, and I do think some people had, I really do, because you could see in the emails where people would just stop working with them and kind of go away. So I do think Americans were figuring it out after a while. I found it at some point that there were several Americans that had worked on his charity to help him before, and they just kind of disappeared. So I think that was happening, and I could have done that too. I know I could have, and my life would have been much easier had I done that. And I don't know what else to say other than that, other than
Okay, murakoze cyane. Ubu muryango Fondation Rusesabagina wayikoreye igihe kingana iki?
So I met with Paul. I was trying to figure it out. I think it was October of 2009. And I know he had me meet with the foundation right after that. But I think I officially started working with them around, it must have been like December of 2009. I faded away after my student, I started distancing myself after when my student finished. And then I wasn't involved at all, except they did invite me to that one meeting, and I attended. But other than that, I had distanced myself from them. But I never told them what I knew.
Wabisohotsemo ryari?
Oh, I think after September, that September 15th meeting, I don't think I had contact with them again after that. And it was easy because I lived in the suburbs. It was an hour drive, and I was very busy. So it was kind of a natural phasing out.
Murakoze. Ikindi kibazo, uretse ibyo waganiraga na Rubingisa, wowe wigeze uganira na Rusesabagina ku birebana n'imikorere ya PDR, imikorere ya FDR n'imikorere ya RNC?
Did I talk with him?
Wowe ubwawe?
No, I did not.
Hari imeri ye ya Rusesabagina waba warabonye ivuga ku mikoranire ya PDR na ku mikoranire ya PDR cyangwa se fondation ye na FDR na RNC, imeri yanditswe na Rusesabagina?
So I can't say with certainty because I have not translated all of the emails. There are a lot of emails I never translated. Kinyarwanda or Swahili is only good so far, so no, I don't know, to tell you the truth. There may be emails. He wasn't active in terms of having a lot of conversations online. Like I said, he was a recipient in most of them. And there are times where he would, again, share information and say, let's discuss, or for your information.
Okay, murakoze. Hari amafaranga ngira ngo amadolari 60,000 wigeze kutubwira ngo Fondation ya Rusesabagina yahaye umuryango wa Rubingisa. Yadusobanurira neza, ntabwo byari byumvikanye neza.
I don't really know more than that, other than there are emails where there's a contract that I believe in the emails that shows the 60,000. The American leader of GFR, there was an email that he wrote to Providence saying, can you please ask Paul if we can use this for salaries? After they were shut down, there were emails about how they were, Global Family Rescue was going to transition to Uganda, and I believe they did. And that's all I know. They did give it. They did give, I believe they gave the grant.
Ibirebana kuba Rusesabagina yarabonanye na Murwanashyaka, wabikubwiye ni Rubingisa cyangwa wabikuye muri za email?
Both. It's in the emails that I read. And then also when I met with Providence Rubingisa on June 4th, 2012, when I was working with U.S. law enforcement, he referenced it as well.
Naho ibirebana na za ntwara watubwiye zo muri Afrika y'Epfo, nabyo niwe wabikubwiye cyangwa nizo email ze wasoma?
Providence Rubingisa told me. That's when he said that Paul had messed it up. What he said is that, I can't pronounce his last name, I'm sorry. that he was supposed to meet at Paul's hotel, and that he instead wanted Paul to meet at his house, and Paul didn't want to. So the meeting didn't happen. Instead, what Paul did, I think in the emails it references earlier earlier meetings between the two of them. But in terms of that one meeting that Providence had referenced, and that is also referenced in the email, Providence told me that was when he said Paul blew it, and that Paul had just given him Jerome's contact information and said that they could meet in a big meeting in Brussels in a few weeks.
umutangabuhamya wakoze cyane, turagushimira.